Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 13th episode of By-The-Bywater, and we have completed our first calendar year. Our first episode was a year ago this month. Thank you all very much if you've been listening since that time, and if you've joined us along the way, we really appreciate it. We certainly hoped it would have been a more fun April to celebrate this anniversary in, but hey, you know and I know, we all know what we're dealing with. We were kind of half making jokes about it last time as things are starting to settle in. No room for that now. We hope you're all doing well. We were just talking about how we're all doing in our various forms of sequestration, and certainly we hope that all of you out there, one, are keeping well, and two, that people you know are keeping well. I have been unlucky in terms of friends who have lost people and things like this, and who knows where things will go from there. So we will not dwell on that too much beyond some notes in our news items, but again, we wish best for everybody. Aside from that, and allowing for the current situation, we all seem to be more or less functioning right now. I don't know.
Speak for yourself.
Let me rephrase that. Yeah, we're making do. Maybe that's the best way to do it. I am growing closer to nature. Meaning I redid some stuff in the backyard because that way I can, one, be outside, and two, do something. So let's plunge right into it. Again, we're wishing well, and we obviously extend that for as long as it'll take, and it may take some time, but we're happy to be here with you. And my goodness, it's great to be able to do a podcast where we can record remotely and put it together. Social distancing in full effect. We are here for you. And we will move on. We do have news, strange as it may seem. Unfortunately, not the best news, but news nonetheless. So we'll kick it off in here. So Jared, please take it away.
So in an absolutely unsurprising move, the Amazon Tolkien TV series is on an extended break from filming, mirroring into nearly the entire film and TV industry worldwide. New Zealand's response to the coronavirus has been a rigorous shutdown on travel and, general activity via a level 4 state of emergency. So filming would have been impossible regardless. The break was originally announced on March 15th with the idea that filming could resume in 2 weeks.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, but this has obviously now turned into an indefinite sort of situation. There's no further word yet on anything else, though the official Twitter account for the production celebrated Tolkien Reading Day on March 25th, the Gondorian New Year, with a quote that reads less like Tolkien and more like a potential line from one of the series scripts. Beyond that, like the rest of us, it's wait and see.
Yeah, that line in particular is kind of odd. I'm looking at it right now. I should send around a link. This was something they sent out on, again, Tolkien Reading Day. And the quote is, again, this is certainly not something in Tolkien. I just don't recall this at all. Nearly all lands have been disturbed these days. Very disturbed, but better times are coming. And I'm like...
No. That reads like a bastardization of the shapes of lands and of seas have changed. Neither have mountains remained steadfast, and to Quivian there is no returning.
You had that one ready to go, didn't you?
But I was going to ask you, Oriana, given the fact that this is obviously a ridiculously unprecedented situation, just sort of realizing this is merely a best guess. So the series was filming for a few weeks, about 6 weeks. Obviously, it stopped. The whole idea was they were talking about, okay, when they had put together the first actual episodes, the writing room would get together again and start planning things out. I haven't heard anything about this, but do you figure they're doing like some remote work based on the shoots they've already got, just sort of say, well, let's see what we can start doing? Or do you think everyone's just sort of like trying to just hunker down? What's your thought on what might be happening?
I have not actually heard anything from any of the writers or seen anything, I guess, is probably, I don't want to imply some sort of insider knowledge at any point. But yeah, I haven't heard anything recently. Although I do know of writers' rooms that are currently working remotely. It's not crazy to think that they may, in fact, still be working on the second season, writing it. But you also kind of have to wonder why they would, I guess, at this point. There's no real reason to, particularly because this delays the release. So we have no idea when that might even happen. So I would imagine that they had not continued work. But hey, if anyone on the writing staff does listen and would like to tell me that you are, Cool. Let me know.
The one thing I was sort of wondering is I know the pretty much all the cast was sort of, I don't want to say stuck there, but by default, they were all there, so everyone was hanging around. Now, I do know from a friend who's a UK person who was in New Zealand around that time and was similarly stuck there because he was only there for just a quick visit. I think arrangements were made, and this has been paralleled at many other spots around the world to get citizens home. And so what I'm sort of half wondering is, if the idea that there isn't going to be any filming for a while, which I'm sure is going to be the case. I mean, I even saw, this is a side note, I saw in looking on one of the New Zealand news sites that they've stopped work on filming on their famous TV series Shortland Street, which is like the TV series,
Oh,
medical
man.
soap opera drama that pretty much every New Zealand actor you've ever heard of has come up through along the way. And that's been running for decades. I mean, it is this established thing, and even they've stopped filming. It's sort of like, okay, everything's. So, I mean, I'm wondering, so many contracts, so many plans. Can you get everyone back together again? But then again, if the schedule is open, surely, maybe, I mean, things are going to, it's going to be very interesting to see where all this goes.
So many moving parts.
There is some other unfortunate, very unfortunate news. So, Oriana, if you could talk us through that one as well.
Yeah, this is a huge bummer. Very, very sad news. British actor and dialect coach Andrew Jack, who worked extensively on Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, among a whole fistful of other films. He passed on due to coronavirus in England at the age of 76. Jack was seen extensively in the behind-the-scene documentaries for the Lord of the Rings films. He had this sort of air of easy professionalism, speaking about the importance of working with actors so they can speak appropriate dialects in the moment rather than simply learning the lines phonetically. I actually wrote, I didn't talk with Andrew Jack for this piece, but I did do a piece for Vox a year plus, about the process of from soup to nuts creating a language for TV and film. And one aspect of it that was helpful for actors in particular was knowing something of the language and not just doing it phonetically, because it is so difficult to imbue emotion into your lines without knowing anything about the language. And so Andrew Jack's work was really essential to why the Sindarin sounded so good in the movies. So this is a big loss, and many of the film's cast members, including Elijah Wood and Sean Astin and Billy Boyd, posted heartfelt tributes. He's kind of the latest of the film's crew members who have unfortunately passed on over the last 20 years. And some of the others that have passed on include sound editor Mike Hopkins, gaffer Brian Bansgrove, and cinematographer Andrew Lesney.
Yeah, another sad addition to that total. And yeah, Jack was, he looked great. I mean, he was kind of the closest person on the entire crew who actually looked like if he needed to sort of stand in for either Gandalf or Saruman, just get him right in there, because he just, had this long, not crazy long hair, but he had this long white hair and this full beard, and he had just really rich rolling voice. You could see why he did so much work as a dialect coach. And yeah, until I was reading the obituary, so many credits, so many different films, and so many, it's astonishing. No wonder he was so well regarded. My favorite moment of him in the documentaries, and it's a bit where this dates the film so perfectly. This is around the dates the moment when they were filmed, I should say. It was around when you might remember late 90s, early 2000s, when blue blockers were becoming the thing for sunglasses, and you see ads for those. And so basically, there was at some point there was camera person was showing putting it over the camera shot just show it work, and it was then cut to Andrew Jack and some other crew member, and the other crew member was like, "Wow, these things work. How'd you get a hold of these?" And Andrew Jack, who again very much from the UK, puts it on, so he now looks like a cool dude and in an incredible West Coast, yeah, man, just burnout voices, yeah, dude, bitchin'. I'm like, I will always remember that, because it's like, that sounds perfect. And yeah, by all accounts, all the we'll link it in the show notes, but the OneRing.net had a link to a variety of the tributes that were posted, and everyone just pretty much was saying just what a really, really solid guy he was. A real loss, a real shame, especially since he was in England. His wife was in Australia. She was similarly sequestered due to quarantine. I mean, this is just, again, the sorrows of our time, simply put. So rest in peace to his memory. No other news, and there may not be any news really for a while on this front. We'll just have to see. I'm sure there'll be just things bubbling up. There's other things to talk about, so now let's move away to something that we can all gleefully get into. And that is the main topic this time. Oh, if you guys had had a chance to see some of the Slack discussions as Jared and Oriana were reading this and venting, but they'll have more to say soon. However, it is time for the main topic. It is my choice, and so I will begin. So let's imagine a scenario. It's the 1960s, and Tolkien's been pondering possibly some sort of continuation story from Middle-earth. In the end, he did briefly write up and then almost immediately abandoned a short fragment entitled The New Shadow, set in Gondor some years into the reign of Aragorn's son Eldarion, which had the feeling of being both a political thriller, as Tolkien himself mentioned it in a letter later, and a bit of a horror story. But instead of this, what if he decided to write a story along these lines? It's about 200 or so years after the War of the Ring, and one day 2 dwarves from the Lonely Mountain, accompanied by a man from Dale, visit the Shire, go to Bag End, and speak with the current occupant, a hobbit scholar of the past, about urgent business. While Sauron's fall has resulted in the destruction of most of his evil creatures, and though Gandalf slew the Balrog after their fall in Moria, Moria itself has remained evil and become a stronghold for a growing remnant of orcs, who, under the control of a new leader from their ranks, have been raiding nearby settlements towards the Anduin and the former Mirkwood, as well as what is left of Lothlorien. The new king under the mountain, Durin the Seventh, has pledged to Eldarion that he will lead an army of dwarves to both destroy this new threat, as well as finally retake Moria itself for their own, and has sent the emissaries to the Shire for any assistance or knowledge that will help in this goal. It turns out this Hobbit scholar has recently rediscovered a remarkable text written out by Gimli, detailing the path in Moria that the Fellowship took. And with his detailed knowledge of this document, both he and his servant volunteer to help the dwarves with their goal. This story is not, as noted, what Tolkien ended up writing. A couple of decades later, however, someone else did. Dennis L. McKiernan, an American author, was one of a clutch of authors in the late 70s and 80s who contributed to what can best be termed post-Tolkien fantasy, a wave of overt imitators that first became known after Tolkien's passing in the late 70s, and which held a deep sway for a long while before writers like J.K. Rowling and George R.R. Martin gave people a new set of initialed authors to clone. With basic structures that were essentially riffs on the general geographic, historical, and mythic bases of Middle-earth, as well as writing a rave of fantasy tropes that the emergence of Dungeons & Dragons had further built on in America in particular, these writers were both incredibly popular and essentially retreading old ground. And even D&D got into the act themselves with the Dragonlance books and games, but that's another matter entirely. 3 American authors in particular, all of whom were published by Del Rey and Associated Imprints, broke out big. Terry Brooks, whose Sword of Shannara did a pretty obvious Lord of the Rings rewrite combined, bizarrely, with a post-nuclear apocalypse setting, which he continues to explore to the present day. Stephen R. Donaldson, whose Thomas Covenant books take on the form of a Freudian violent Narnia, its lead figure a literally leprous antihero whose journeys to an otherworldly location simply called The Land may or may not be real. And David Eddings, who admitted to the Tolkien connection, but also pretty much aimed for a rambling synthesis of all kinds of fantasy forebears, from William Morris and Lord Dunsany to Fritz Leiber and beyond, in his Belgariad and Malorian series. McKiernan, as I mentioned at the end of the last episode, apparently originally conceived of what was then called the Silver Call Duology as a more or less formal sequel to The Lord of the Rings. Without going over all that again, his own fantasy setting, Mythgar, is, at least in terms of his first books, the Iron Tower trilogy, Middle-earth as we know it, though again with its own variants. The Mordor equivalent is in the north, the Aragorn and Arwen analogues are both human and both belong to royal families, there's no Gandalf or Gollum or even the Ring equivalents, and so forth. With all that as general background, though, the scenario I outlined at the start here is exactly what McKiernan told as a story, with, obviously, all the names changed, and we'll all have more to say about that later. Suffice to say that in the Silver Call books, individually titled Trek to Kragan Kor, because Trek to Khazad-dûm kind of has that copyright problem, and the Brega Path, again because the Gimli Path would raise questions, the 2 hobbits, the 2 Werrows, Perry the Daydreaming Scholar, and his servant Cotton, Yes, I'm not kidding about that. Act is pretty much the Frodo and Sam of this new story, which is doubly weird since in the Iron Tower books, while the protagonists were Weros as well, there wasn't a Frodo-Sam analog at all. Regardless, Perry and Cotton accompany the emissaries from Not Dale and Not the Lonely Mountain to leave the Not Shire, briefly visit Not Bree, and stay at the Not Prancing Pony, eventually cross the Not Misty Mountains to meet up with the Not Durin the Seventh. He's Durek Deathbreaker here, but of course, by the shores of the Not Anduin. Seriously, you don't need an overall map of Mythgar for the story. Just take the actual Middle-earth map, swap out all the names, you'll be fine if you ever want to read this. Not that you should, but we'll get on to that in our much greater detail in our discussion. These books are both a strangely functional what-if story, picking up on cues in both the main story of The Lord of the Rings and the appendices, where, for instance, a Durin the Seventh is specifically mentioned as a future dwarf king, and a bizarre, tonally shifting, haphazard attempt to write a Tolkien-scale epic without being able to stick the landing or execute much along the way. And yet, for all that, these books have had a weird fascination for me ever since I first read them back in the late 80s. I've had and kept ragged paperback copies of them and the Iron Tower books to this day. Now, McKiernan has continued to write stories set in Mythgar over the decades. Indeed, he's still alive and literally just turned 88 earlier this month, so happy belated, I guess. And he's spoken in the past about how he freely admitted those first books of his were essentially him woodshedding, with greater enthusiasm than skill. Both the Iron Tower and Silver Call books have been republished and revised, for instance. But for the purposes of this episode, we read the original 2 Silver Call books as published, and believe me, as they'll tell you, my co-host did not thank me for it. But I'll make one big devil's advocate moment here before I open things up to discussion, or perhaps more accurately, vivisection. McKiernan shares one specific thing in common with Tolkien. He's a military veteran, and indeed there's plenty of points in the Silver Call books in the context of the Dwarf Army where you get a sense of how military morale works, chains of command and supply, and so forth. He himself joined the Air Force when he was 18 years old, serving during the Korean War, though he didn't directly serve in Korea itself. So contrasting their experiences can't be exact, but it's notable that in both the Iron Tower and Silver Call books, McKiernan is often more blunt about war's impact than Tolkien is. As an example, where in Lord of the Rings there is the Scouring of the Shire sequence, and a wonderful sequence it is, what's happened there isn't anything like the equivalent in the Iron Tower books, where the Shire equivalent is ravaged early on by an evil army, numerous innocents are found brutally killed, and so forth. Now, this doesn't excuse the books or their deficiencies as literature, of course. Good intentions have never automatically meant good art, and indeed the closing pages of the Silver Call even muddy the waters on the front of the cost of war a bit further. Yet it's also notable that McKiernan, in his own fashion, really teases out some elements about war that are in Tolkien but not fully explored, even on a grunt everyday soldier level, as well as the sense of defenses and last stands when nobody will be around to celebrate one's heroics, as is mentioned more than once in the context of characters from Rohan in particular, and what war's cost can truly be in terms of mass trauma, something that in Tolkien is almost telescoped completely down to the character of Frodo alone. So here are 2 snippets from the end of the second Silver Call book, which both illustrate McKiernan's writing limitations, and yet show how he's trying to reach for something that, even if the sentiments are familiar, are still good sentiments to remember. First, before the final battle in the book, the Dwarf King Durek speaks to Perry as part of a bitter discussion about why a rescue team can't be sent to look for some allies of theirs who have been lost while on what proved to be an unnecessary raid under the mountains. Quote, "Take heed, missions fail. Only in the fairyscapes of children's heart tales do all goodly quests succeed. But in this world many a desperate undertaking has fallen full victim to dark evil, or has been thwarted, turned back, or shunted aside, or delayed, not reaching the planned end, costing the coursing lifeblood of steadfast comrades. All warriors who encounter such calamities and who live on must learn to accept these truths and go forth." The second snippet occurs after said final battle, where despite complete victory, most of the dwarf army has been killed in the effort, and the reaction of most of the immediate survivors is literal numb shock. Durek comes across the emissary from Dale equivalent in Mythgar, holding the body of his younger brother and weeping over the loss. End quote. It was in this poignant moment of kin-death lamentation that at last the cost of the victory came clear to Durek. He quickly pulled his hood over his head, and his face fell into shadow, for no one should look on the heart grief of dwarves, for to look upon dwarf bale is to gaze upon sorrow beyond measure. And the Dwarf King sank to his knees and choked upon his own woe. His glistening tears fell to splash upon the stone, and great sobs racked his frame, and as he and uncounted others grieved in deep despair. But the slain of the death war heeded them not. End quote. Again, not exactly artful in terms of literature. The sentiments are good. Having said that, I've spent almost maybe too much praise on him working on here. And these two have been raring to go for 2 weeks now. So who wants to go first, and what do you want to complain about?
Actually, I want to say, before we actually get to the complaining, is that I do think that this is a fascinating idea for a Lord of the Rings sequel. I really appreciate that about it. There's not a whole lot else I appreciate about it, but I think that's a solid idea. There's some really interesting sequences that don't work, but you could see how they might work if somebody else wrote them. The fight at what is the west door of Moria, but not really. And they fight the Watcher in the water and kill it. Spoilers, not that anybody was going to read it. And that, it's so clunky and awful, but that is actually, I think, the only sequence that I really enjoyed at all was how they managed to take down this thing that is, just Cthulhu in a pond. So, yeah, I liked that. Didn't like anything else.
Well, that is one of the few points where there's certainly in the first book where there is actual. Wait, is it the first book?
Yeah, it's
the
first book. Yeah.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
But that is
end of
one
the first book. Yeah.
Yes. So yes, that is the only point at which there is any actual tension in the narrative, at which I was like, oh, what is going to happen? And what's unfortunate is that I had to keep rereading it because McKiernan, and respect a veteran and a guy who is probably a pretty decent person. I don't mean this to disrespect him as a person. I didn't realize he's still alive, but he's such a poor writer that it's really difficult to, again, it's a cool, Ned, when you put the whole story in terms of here's what it would be if it were Lord of the Rings, which it clearly is, or, Middle Earth, it is much easier to follow. It is much clearer. It makes a lot more sense. And I don't want to say that McKiernan should not have been allowed to write or to tell this story or anything like that. But there is a strange hubris at work here, I feel like, where so McKiernan was in the Air Force and then became an electrical engineer, judging by the bio in the back of the book. And that's cool and good, and we need engineers. But there is this weird thing where he was like, yeah, I'm the person to write this story. I'm the one who can do this, and then kind of wastes a premise. Because, as you said, there are some really interesting themes here, but the writing is so bad, and he doesn't seem to understand how to tell a story. It's like he'd only ever read a couple books before, a couple works of fiction, and it reminded me so much of when I was 13, 14, I wrote a total ripoff of the David Eddings books. And this reminded me, I was like, oh, I'm reading my own writing from when I was 13, 14. The description of every single minuscule detail of every single day of the journey that these Weros take. You
can't say the name without laughing. Hard.
Come on. Werlinga. It's like, okay, we know that you saw that Rohan called them different. We get it. The hubris really bothered me, I think, throughout the whole thing. I was like, come on.
Yeah, there's something really weird about, here I think maybe a good distinction between, say, Tolkien and someone like him, someone like McKiernan, but you could apply this across the board to many of these other writers I mentioned, is that you have the difference between, in this particular case, and obviously not saying that this is a requirement for people, precisely because, storytellers can come from all walks of life, and good thing too. But in the case of this particular level of in-depth epic fantasy, shall we say, the difference between a scholar in particular fields
Mm-hmm.
who had also been working on this for literal decades
Yep.
versus somebody who, by his own admission in the prologue that I shared with you, which I'll briefly elaborate on here a bit, his introduction for the Iron Tower book, someone who enjoyed reading authors like Tolkien and other authors, not necessarily known as a writer before that, without knowing exactly what he had done before this, if anything. Could have been private efforts or just whatever.
Sure.
It kind of ties into our fan art discussion that we had in the last episode, which is part of the reason why I also thought about this too. This is fan art writ large. This is probably the most elaborate example of fan art published, at least here in America, for Lord of the Rings that exists, quite honestly. I mean, there's nothing else that I know of that is so literally, clearly a crypto sequel to Lord of the Rings in so much detail down the board. I mean, I can't think of anything else like it. And yeah, the premise is good. But to get back to my point, what's interesting is that to your point, Oriana, is that you're saying that it seems like he hasn't read much, but by his own admission, he's not only in this little prologue to Iron Tower, he mentions Tolkien, but he mentions 4 other authors. Interestingly, they're all fantasy authors, and notably, they're all women, which is kind of refreshing because so many people sort of like it's bros in their stories. Here's somebody who has actually he mentions Catherine Kurtz. The Darren books have their own thing, but up and down. But they very much had an impact. They were certainly up there in terms of knowledge in the subculture in the 60s through the 80s and beyond to a degree. Le Guin. Obviously Earthsea. I mean, yes, Patricia McKillip. That's a great mention. The Riddle Master books and so forth. And he's mentioning these interesting writers, this clutch of interesting writers, American writers, pretty much, aside from Tolkien, who are also women writers from the 70s, from the 60s and 70s. It's like you've got this really good range here. What happened?
Yeah.
The difference, I think, when someone is enamored by by what they read, and they're reading some excellent authors, and like, I'll give it a go. There's nothing wrong with giving it a go, but it got to this point where it's all published. I'm still wondering about that. Yeah.
I guess maybe my real beef lies with the publishers here, who are clearly trying to capitalize on a trend, I guess. But it really is one of those deeply annoying, I think, to see something so clumsy, I think, to the point where, like, Ned, you said a line that something you said that really stood out to me was you can just it's just the map of Middle Earth, essentially. But even so, there is no map of Mithgar in these editions that we have, and I was struggling because, like, I knew that we were going to not Bree. I knew that we were going to not Moria, and yet the prose is so tangled that I simply could not. I had so much difficulty being like, where the hell are they? Where is anything? Where am I? What, am I still alive? What's happening?
Yeah, well, like they cross the not Misty Mountains, and it's this whole thing that happens. Then they're on the other, like, they split the party, to use a D&D term. One part goes over the mountains, does some bullshit stuff with the Great River, and then, like, goes back to Moria. So it's confused. It's actually, I think it's worse if you know Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
Because in the Lord of the Rings, it takes them days to get, it's at least a few nights to get, like, even just through Lothlorien. But this group goes over the mountains to the Great River, has some crappy fight where we meet Shannon. I think that's where it is. And then we'll get to Shannon later. And then they go back to Moria and go inside. And it's this weird sequence that doesn't make geographical sense, I think, even on the page, but it's even worse if you know Lord of the Rings and you're like, they should have taken a little longer to get there. Right? They should be more exhausted. This is not
the splitting of the party. Okay, can we discuss that just from a storytelling standpoint? We have our Frodo and Sam. They are so clearly set up to be Frodo and Sam. Our not Frodo, Peregrine, literally Peregrine Fair, like, Jesus.
I'm going to vomit. I'm just
But so we have not Frodo and not Sam, and they are together. They are master and servant, as in The Lord of the Rings. Cool, I get it. The whole point of the Frodo and Sam bond in The Lord of the Rings is very evident. It's just like, oh, okay, these are we're exploring this dynamic and this bond and the ways it changes and the ways it doesn't. Cool. And they're together the whole time. McKiernan splits them up. Harry goes with the people going into Moria because
the squad.
The squad, literally called the squad. And I know that some of our revulsion for that, I know that some of our revulsion for that word comes from our existence in this time where squad goals is a particularly irritating thing. But
it also feels anachronistic.
Yes.
I don't know if it is or not, but it's like the Tiffany problem. If it is, it's something that could be, I know it's not really the Middle Ages. I know that. But the vibe is Middle Ages.
Yes, and yet...
So does the word squad exist? We don't know. They use it. I don't know. Okay, I'm done. I swear.
Well, no, that brings us to, like, the problem of the language in general. There are so many things in that, like, just random little words that, like, we had a whole bunch of these in the Slack, but I know that, like...
just open the chat and just reenact our dialogue.
Just open it up. One of the hobbits, werrows, looks askew at a dwarf, and their eyes are gems, and they're described as, like, emerald green eyes.
Or emeraldine.
Yeah,
just say green.
Sapphire blue, and it's like, no, you can just say sapphire. Did no one edit this book?
In a lot of ways, it reads as like a parody of Tolkien.
Yeah.
Because rather than say midnight, which Tolkien uses the word midnight, like a human being would.
Right.
This book consistently, every single time, I don't think there's any exceptions, says mid of night. So it's like, long about the mid of night, the Warrows and the dwarves. And it's like, no, just say midnight. I promise you. It's okay.
Word.
It's okay. It's weird because, like, the conceit of this book, first of all, as I think Ned said in the introduction, is that, like, the dwarves are coming to the Shire to read the Red Book of Westmarch to understand how Moria is laid out. Those are not the names of anything in the story, but, And then this book is, again, like another translation from Hobbit records is the thing. But in Lord of the Rings, because it's written by hobbits, the language morphs in terms of, like, the social context that the hobbits are in. Mm-hmm. So it gets really, really elevated and intricate and archaic when they're in Gondor, and then switches back to a different register for the Shire or whatever. And that all makes sense, and that's why it is the way it is, because they adapt, even in the appendices, Tolkien's like, the hobbits adapted their language to whoever they were with. That's awesome. That's such an interesting detail. This book only has the one register, and it's the irritating one.
Yep. It's the narrative tone, the narrator's tone it's always, like, weirdly silly. It's almost as though the narrator of The Hobbit were narrating this book. And that is...
But, like, if he was drunk.
Yeah.
Drunk Werrow history.
Or maybe it was, like, a very young Werrow who was... And that's, like... It's interesting that the whole... very little of it makes actual sense. I was getting really mad about it, and then at the end, Ned, as you read in that passage, is like, oh, well, that's the point. This is all senseless, but we do it anyway, or, that sort of thing. And it's like... But I just read this whole bleep, like 300 pages for what?
That reminded me, I think we were going to talk about splitting the party.
Right.
That does not pay off. And not in a way where it's like, oh, the futility of all mortal endeavors. Not like that. Just in a story way. It doesn't do anything.
Right.
So we split the party, and it ends up feeling like a D&D campaign where the players aren't picking up on the clues, and the DM is just like, oh, you just meet. It's fine.
God, okay? You're meeting.
Yeah, fine. You're back at the door. Like, there's a time limit for this. Like, they split the party so the squad can go through Moria and get to the west door, which, if you recall from the movies or books, the Watcher in the Water blocks. They're supposed to go through the inside and, like, memorize the path, because in this book, dwarves can memorize wherever they've been, which is kind of cool. Get to the door, and then, like, clear any rebel away on that side, and then at the same time, the main army is going to come through the ancient elf kingdom that was there, and, like, clear the door on the outside, and then they open the doors and they can invade Moria, and that's the point of this thing. that doesn't happen. It doesn't work out as planned. And that's fine, because it's really boring if you lay out a plan early in a story and then it goes exactly according to plan. That's just dull. But it should at least fall apart in interesting ways. And it doesn't. It just is one thing after another, and it doesn't matter in any way. Not even thematically. It's not like, again, it has nothing to do with the senselessness of war or whatever. It's just, it doesn't matter.
It's just, I feel like I need to wrap this up. But yeah, it's totally, like, I didn't understand in the first place why not Sam goes with the dwarf army and has all those adventures. And oh my god, they remark so much upon the fact that they both have had adventures and who had the most adventures, and Jesus Christ, why is this in the book? Why? No one talks like this. But anyway, so like the explanation in the book that's given is that not Sam also knows, has the Brega path memorized, so he has to go with the dwarf army because they need a guide, even though if they can't open the doors properly, there's no point anyway. Also, they have the copies of the Brega Path description because they bring like 10 of them. They just have like a shit ton of copies of this thing around and carried with them. Ned, why?
That's explained in the book. I think one of them says, well, we can't be consulting a scroll at every fork in the road or something like that.
You absolutely can.
That's why you have scrolls.
Right?
So you can consult them.
I don't know what to tell you guys. I'm just saying what's in the book. I mean, some of the stuff you've been rightfully going on about. I mean, there's the
going on.
No. I mean, please go on. I mean, this has been great. I'm just sitting back and like, hey, I haven't had contributed to the episode much. This will be great for editing.
This episode is just Oriana and Jared yelling.
Yeah, I just set it up and I let him go.
Yeah.
He does have in some of the same bit sequences that I was quoting from earlier, one of the other characters basically saying, yes, it turned out to be a useless mission, but we didn't know that when we went on it because we didn't know. And I'm like, again, trying to look at it from a point of view, it's sort of like, you sometimes have to take a risk. Okay, fine. Having set that aside, every point you've been raised is incredibly valid, and there are many more to bring up. So I'll just sort of throw in a little more about Cotton.
Oh my god.
Can I leave the room for this part?
No, you stay right there.
I hate Cotton so goddamn much.
So again, Cotton to again explain, we've been talking about the not Frodo and not Sam. Well, the not Frodo is again Perry, short for Peregrine.
Why?
Jesus.
And then Cotton, I forget Cotton's last name, but he is again the Sam equivalent.
It's like Bucklebur or something.
Cottonbur. Yeah, Cotton.
Oh God, yeah, I don't want to know. But anyway, so the thing with Cotton is, again, this is sort of fits into, and we can start cast this widely for all the characters in this story. There are no really interesting characters in this story is the problem. Everyone is too much of an archetype, and here's a way to think about it. The characters in Lord of the Rings, although you're meant to have people who are like representational, Legolas and Gimli perhaps most obviously, here is the elf with us and here is the dwarf with us. Mm-hmm. At the same time, they are individually themselves. Gimli is not every dwarf. And we talked about it in the dwarves episode that we did a couple of months ago, as Oriana brought up, that Gimli is sort of given spin on a character to make him stand out from the earlier dwarves. There is that as well. But again, Legolas is not Elrond. And who they are comes out in the story bit by bit, sort of in shades and in moments. You see that emerge, but it's meant to be these individual riffs on someone who's part of a larger society, but they're still individual ones. The problem with all the ones here, even the dwarves, who are essentially interchangeable for the most part, is that everybody is stereotypically themselves. It's sort of like, in terms of the dwarves are the vast majority of the characters, quote unquote, in the story, more or less by default. Aside from the king, whose most notable thing is that he rasps a lot, and he does rasp a lot. Duras rasps this, he just apparently can't speak.
Oh, he rumbles too. I found a rumble.
Ah, you found a rumble? Very good. And then you have the two initial emissaries, the brothers, who are both similar like, and they're just sort of like, they're sort of like, not quite haughty dwarf stereotypes, but there's like, honor and speaking of things and stolid and all that. And they're meant to be, good characters. But again, they're not much there. And everybody else is their own stereotype. And Cotton, to get back to him, is the worst of the bunch. And here's an illustrative example. So Cotton, again, is meant to be the not Sam. He speaks in a self-consciously, and this is another example of McKiernan learning from the tropes, but not having grown up internalizing why characters talk like that. Why Frodo and Sam sound different. Tolkien is specifically referencing for the fact that he's English and the fact he knows languages and dialect. Characters speak differently.
Yeah.
Characters are meant to be, whether it's combination of class and location or whatever. In this case, we have Cotton is meant to be speaking like Sam. Sam can be interpreted as comical. Bakshi's Lord of the Rings famously did that, much to its detriment. And Sean Astin spoke very much about how when he was cast as Sam for Lord of the Rings, he saw the Bakshi version. He's like, oh my God, I hope Peter Jackson isn't planning on doing that. And it turned out not to be the case. There is humor in Sam, but it's a different kind of humor and emerges in different ways. You don't get that with Cotton. You either get overbearing earnestness or wackiness.
Yeah.
And the two combined are just horrible. And here's a good example about how McKiernan handling the character doesn't handle it the same way as Tolkien's. So in Lord of the Rings, when the Fellowship hits Lothlorien, there's the moment where they meet the first elves there, and they go up in the tree, and there's, I forget the exact line, but Legolas is talking with them, and Sam's like, oh yeah, it's elves, and Legolas sort of laughs a bit and says, yes, and they're saying you're breathing so loud that they could just shoot you in the dark. And Sam sort of goes like, whoop, and there's a brief reference to him just sort of keeping very, very quiet, trying not to breathe so loud as he goes up to meet them. And it's a sort of funny moment. Sam is suddenly very self-conscious, but that's it. You don't get that in this. Instead, you get moments like this when the initial group is crossing the not Misty Mountains to go meet the dwarf army, and they have this whole sequence where they meet this. They're warned about avalanches, and they get this extremely long, tendentious thing from one of the dwarves, or something about what avalanches are. It's like, you don't need to go into this much detail. And then you get this really horrible moment of comedy where it's sort of like Cotton looks around and goes like, newfound respect, and he makes a buttoning motion on his lips as this mums the word, and I'm like going like, yeah, okay. Thanks, 1930s, comedy, stock comedy, Little Rascals film guy. That's not what Sam was doing. It's these tiny details that again, to the larger point of McKiernan here, McKiernan clearly loves Lord of the Rings, but he's loved it, to borrow from Shakespeare, not too wisely, but too well. And he's like, let's stir it up. And yeah, to throw names out here, since we brought up names, let's talk Shannon. Let's talk Shannon and Ursor.
I could not.
What's the point of Ursor?
I almost threw the book across the room when it was like, everyone has a billion names in these books, and I know that Tolkien did that too, but like, it was not an all at once thing. You're introduced to Strider. You're introduced to Strider as Strider. You later figure out, oh, this is Aragorn. Oh, so many other names, but we refer to him as like one name. Mm-hmm. Shannon, first of all, why? Is there an Irish? Where is this coming from? Like, and it's like Shannon Silverleaf. It's like, does Shannon mean
Shannon Silverleaf?
Silverleaf? Does Vanadier mean, like, what is the linguistic basis for this? It's like he hasn't stopped. McKiernan has clearly not thought about the roots of this, and it's just Shannon?
Well, what's weird is that his real name is Vanadier. His like name that he goes by is Shannon. I don't know why. I don't think that's said. It's
never...
whatever. Yeah, and then his like epithet is Silverleaf, and this is clearly like Legolas Greenleaf, because Legolas means Greenleaf. Vanadier, if you read the appendices of this book, means Silverleaf. But like Legolas is only called Legolas Greenleaf like once or twice, I feel like. It's not it's not repeated. This is all the time Shannon Greenleaf or Silverleaf. And why is his name Shannon?
Yeah, where does it just complete, like, did he not think that would completely take people out of the narrative?
At no point did he consider that anything might take anybody out of the narrative.
Where are the editors?
They died. They just
I killed them all. That way they can print it as it stands.
The editors died, and then their portfolio was handed on to somebody else who was like, I can't do two jobs, and just passed everything on to the next person.
Just go with it.
This is like the opening credits to Monty Python and the Holy Grail. The people responsible for these have been sacked. They've been replaced. But yeah, so I mentioned Ursor. You might as well mention him. Yeah, so we get this is the odd.
I'm truly sorry. Really to interrupt. I'm truly sorry for everybody listening for all the vomiting noises that I keep making unintentionally. Like, this is just what this book brings out of me.
Oh, believe me, when I mentioned this to Slack, when Jared hadn't quite gotten there yet, he would just about had a conniption. It was amazing. But yeah, so I have been describing with the not everything. So there are, we've got Bjorn, as we all remember from The Hobbit, wonderful character,
He's awesome.
and the idea that there was this people were the Bjornings, which is mentioned in Lord of the Rings. Well, we have the equivalent here. Well, he's fighting with Shannon as they run into the squad, blah blah blah, and all the rest of it. Oriana died. I'm sorry, Oriana died. This is her shade speaking to you now, but she literally almost fell out of camera shot. That was kind of amazing to see. I have not seen that in a year. Anyway, and Ursor is meant to be essentially the Bjorn of this book, even though there is, again, no equivalent Lord of the Rings directly. But because he's this big burly guy, he's a woodsman. Go around and they're hunting all the not orcs. We'll get to the orc names, by the way, in a second, because that is the most complicating thing of his entire mythology here. And he goes around, beats orcs over the head, or the orc equivalents over the head with his mace. Fine. And he's doing it for vengeance because his wife and his child were killed by them. Okay, your standard stuff, familiar of 8 million westerns, etc. Blah, blah, blah. But the point is he's named Ursor. Why? Because like Ursa Major, bears, it's meant to be a bear thing. So instead of giving a character, they give him this weird fake Latinate Ursor because of this. But here's the funny part. Unlike Bjorn, he does not turn into a bear. He just is a guy named Ursor.
Why?
Why?
Is it just like a fun... Did he think like, oh, this will be a fun little nod to people who loved Bjorn because it's so obvious he's beeping Bjorn. I'm doing my own beeping to keep this as PG as possible. But yeah, like it's just so many elements of this are just why, including the orc names, which are baffling. I mean, I get it.
God.
But there's like, first of all, having to explain the exposition in this is bizarre and so poorly done. But there's there's 5 kinds of orcs, or no, they're like evil. They're 5 like evil things.
Forgive me, people. I'm going to be taking you deep into Iron Tower trilogy lore here. There's you do not see the Gulls, who are not ghouls, but they're closely spelled that way. You do not see the Volgs, who are not wargs, but should be wargs. And then you do not see the Hailsteeds, who are not horses, they're just evil.
Okay.
They even though they are looking like horses, they are not in the Silver Call books. You don't have to worry about them. You do get trolls. Oh boy, that's the sort of secret at the end of the book, I guess. But you get the annoying thing is, yes, you have the orc equivalents. The real problem is this: when in Tolkien, again, here's a good example. Tolkien has the orcs. Okay, goblins in Little Hobbit, etc., etc. Set all that aside. We were pretty much just saying, who are these creatures who look like this, do this collectively? They're orcs. There are some differences in orc breeds are talked about. You have the Uruk-hai as their own thing, but you very much says like, what are they? Those are orcs. The end. Here, it's complicated because what's happened is that McKiernan has introduced 2 specific kind of orcs that he draws distinctions between. There's, I forget the exact names. The problem is there's like a shorter bunch, and then there's a smaller grouping who's like the taller bunch. And the taller bunch are the ones who are more or less in charge. But then the problem is not only do these 2 separate breeds have their own names in all these different languages, but then collectively this bunch of evil things is called different names in all these other languages too. So you have essentially an overlapping, instead of saying, orcs, some variants, but orcs, you have, those are the this that are called by the this that are over like this, and they're part of this. It's like,
and every characters are telling this to other characters like multiple times, and in using different, like it's so confused. It took me like, maybe because I was maybe not reading as carefully as I should have been. It's possible. But like, the difference between they're especially like they're all 3 letters, the different words for orcs in these books. They're like word. They're Yerm, Gurg, and word. And it's like, where can I buy a vowel here? Do I have to buy a vowel? It took me forever to realize, this is the dwarves call them Gurg, The men call them Yurm.
I think, yeah.
Awesome.
I mean, but it's
Good
just,
God. Like,
There is a table in the back of the book that lists all the different,
what?
like, here's what they are, and then like across the top there's like the elves call them this, men call them this, dwarves call them this, and it's all like variations of the same word. It doesn't help anything, but it's like if the I'm tripping over my own tongue now. It's like if the Uruk-hai, there's orcs, and then the Uruk-hai had like 5 different names among people that they were killing. It's that level of confusion where there's literally 5 names for the same thing, and depending on what race the character is, they call them by that name. So within the same conversation, there's like a man calling them Rook or whatever they are, and then there's a dwarf calling them Gurg or whatever, and then there's a Waro calling them blah, and then the elves have it is needlessly confusing.
Yeah.
I think in concept it makes sense, but in execution, it's like they're all speaking common. They are all speaking the same language. Why do they all have to use their own words?
And Jared pointed out in discussion in our Slack channel about how you get an equivalent scene briefly in Lord of the Rings, but with a different emotional heft, and that's where when the Fellowship approaches Moria, and Gimli sees the mountains, and he essentially just briefly trips out. He's like, "This is my homeland,"
Yeah.
And he mentions the different names for what's there, but for him, it's very much a matter of you speak it into existence. This is what it means to us.
Mm-hmm.
We know these are the other names, and then Sam has a great comment, which is again good comedy, but in a gentle way. He's sort of like, "Man, I was interested in maybe learning dwarf language, but he mentioned all this, man." Total jawcracker, wow, and all
what
that.
a jawcracker the dwarf tongue is.
Yeah, so which is a great line, and but yeah, no, this sense of just this needless confusion, it makes no sense.
Well, this goes back to what Oriana was saying. Oh, sorry, about the needless level of detail in the books.
Oh my God!
Is that Tolkien is very detailed,
sure,
but there's usually an emotional reason for it.
Yeah,
or it's a world building detail that isn't repeated 75 times. The characters having different names doesn't matter. They don't need to call everything by all these different names. Or there's really granular details about how the army's supply chain functions. There's 5 different colors of wagon. They all do different things, and there's one color per each, one of each color per every 100 soldiers or whatever. And it's all okay, great. I'm glad you thought about that. I don't need it laid out, especially since it doesn't pay off in any way.
Nope.
It doesn't matter narratively
Nope.
later on. It's just detail for the sake of showing your work. And it's this is not your algebra homework, Dennis. Just write a story, please.
Well, how'd you like the digression into rock climbing tools there?
Oh my
when the
God.
squad got into things? And we should mention this. You see, we none of us are joking when we say how closely this is mapped onto being Lord of the Rings thing here. Kragan Kor, aka Casa Doom, blah blah blah, is so mapped from Moria, from Lord of the Rings, the whole thing. I mean, literally, the geography and everything, it's 4 mountains instead of 3. That's really the only difference.
Yeah.
The whole details of the path, everything about it, there is a room next to where the road parts into different directions, that there is a grate in the door, bottom and all that, that's all there. And this was all in the Iron Tower books, to give you an idea. I mean, this whole journey was cloned there, too, is the point.
Ugh.
And the point is, there is or was a Balrog equivalent. And even though there was no Gandalf equivalent, the Balrog equivalent was killed in the Iron Tower books. I won't bother going to details. The point is, there was the same confrontation space of a vast hall and then a slim bridge over a bottomless chasm. This is all in the Silver Call books. Everything it's in the Iron Tower books. It's all in there. So you have this whole sequence about having to, potentially cross or get a bridge up or going across there. It's it's one of these things you're just on the one hand, you can see what he's trying to do. Write a sequel to Lord of the Rings using the Moria things. At the same time, it's
Must you?
Partially because I'm seeing some of Oriana's notes here to give you an idea of the useless level of detail that's gotten to the not Bree equivalent, which is called Stonehill. It has a prancing pony. I forget what the name of it is.
Oh, the white unicorn. The white unicorn. I'm pretty sure.
I totally forgot that. Oh my God.
Jesus.
Okay.
Yeah. At least it wasn't the dancing horse or something like that. But
The frolicking pony.
But instead of you see in the Iron Tower books, the proprietor is a Bockelman Brewster, not Barliman Butterbur. It's a Bockelman Brewster. You see, that's important.
Everything has the same syllable count. It's okay.
And then we have in this story, in this version, we have his grandson or whatever, Arbergon Brewster, who is essentially Barliman from Lord of the Rings. He comes out, he basically endlessly wiping his hands on his apron and all that. So it's just again, he takes the trappings. That's the thing. McKiernan takes the trappings of everything and just rewrites the trappings.
It's the trapping without the substance.
Right, yeah. I mean, Barliman as a character in Lord of the Rings is, he's meant to be much more, comical less, but he's also shown to be good-hearted. He's just a simple tavern master to a degree, but he's also one who just sort of has a, as Gandalf says, he can see through a brick wall in time. So, which is a great thing. You don't get the sense from these characters in this one. So, and to step back to something Jared was bringing up earlier briefly, he mentioned about charts in the end of the book. Yes, that's a key thing here. In both these and the Iron Tower books, as opposed to the Shannara books, as opposed to the Belgariad, as opposed to all the other knockoffs I mentioned, McKiernan goes to the trouble, and it's trouble, of actually creating his own appendices to these books.
But it's bad. It's bad.
Yes, they're not good appendices. Useless chronologies, all that. It's everything that you find in the Lord of the Rings appendices. It's a slavish tribute.
This is just you had all this in the text.
Oh, that fucking battle language.
The battle language. You want to talk about the battle language? Okay, so we have the Rohirrim. They're called the Harlingar in this case, and a small squad of them is attached with the dwarf army. At one point, there is a side thing that they have to do to pursue a small band of scouts who are going to warn the bad guys in the Urim, the Gurg, etc., in not Moria, about their doings. And so the idea is that the fake Rohirrim set up an ambush, and there's talked about their battle language. Their battle language sucks, and they do the equivalent of the ready, aim, fire, kind of, in this thing. It's 3 words, and the idea is thing is in the books, in the chapter, McKiernan goes to the trouble of telling you he gives the command and then tells you the English equivalent in
brackets.
In brackets, in parentheses. It's
I could have figured that out from context,
And for instance, the word for attack is logically Vitaku.
Vitaku.
V apostrophe TTACK.
Oh, that brings up one. Speaking of apostrophes, real quick. I don't think my dude knows how apostrophes work because the book that contains all of this stuff is the Raven book.
Yep.
Thereafter, in the text, when it's referenced, though, it is apostrophe book.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Apostrophe capital B book.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the in is not the white, it's the white unicorn. And then the second, on second reference, it's apostrophe unicorn and the U is caps. It's that's not how apostrophes work.
I totally missed that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. He uses it a lot. Yeah. I mean, he may have borrowed it from someone else somewhere else, but yeah, no, it's why am I seeing this? So, and he used that in the Iron Tower books too. It's a tick.
It's wild. It's wild. Again, where were the editors? Was published
I'll tell you where the editors were. They were not editing the poetry.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to set this up before Jared and Oriana really go to town here. I'll say that, one of those common comments and complaints of people who are Tolkien's I can't quite get through. Man, there's too much poetry. The Ring poem is great, but everything else, I don't know, and all that. And, the thing is, Tolkien's poetry is thing, but I think is, it really works more times than not. But you have to get to the grips of it. But he knows how rhymes work. He knows how language works.
He knows how meter works.
He creates these things that really work in various modes. He actually does something that does that. Even in his invented languages, he makes things that work.
Yeah.
So let's just say that McKiernan tries to do that, and it does not.
He even has that. So that fourth Aorlingus thing from Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
He has that for the crappy Rohirrim. Yeah.
Okay.
Dramatic reading.
Arise, Harlingar, to arms! Fortune's 3 faces now turn our way, one smiling, one grim, one secret. May the never-seen face remain always hidden, that's all one line. Hal, warriors of the spear and saber! Hal, warriors of the knife and arrow! Hal, warriors of the horn and horse! Ride forth, Harlingar, ride forth!
There are literal tears in my eyes.
You heard how Oriana read it. Here's the original, which is only 5 lines, so it's shorter. Listen to how differently that what you just heard sounds to what he is trying to invoke here. Arise, arise, riders of Theoden. Fell deeds awake, fire and slaughter. Spear shall be shaken, shield be splintered. A sword day, a red day, ere the sun rises. Ride now, ride to Gondor. I mean, that's perfect. I mean, that's a big, or it's heroic mode. It's compact. You can sense the use of, like, you know, the bound, the rhyme, the meter, how, like, the repetition of consonants. It all makes sense.
What is the meter for this? What is...
Tolkien knew Old English. He wrote letters in Old English to his son and all that. And he knows how the poetry works, so he's able to duplicate it for his, like, quasi Old English culture here.
Right.
McKiernan has no idea how well poetry in general works, but especially this poetry. So it just ends up sounding like you put the original through a shredder and assembled it incorrectly.
It's a copy of a copy of a copy is what it feels like, or as though you translated Tolkien into, let's say, Finnish through Google Translate and then translated it back, because Google Translate doesn't like agglutinative languages. It doesn't deal with them very well. So that's what it feels like, honestly. The poetry is really bad, and it's really frequent. It's so much, it feels more frequent.
Wait, we got to read the road poem.
Oh yeah, wait, where?
Yeah, so you know that, the road goes ever on and on down from the road where it began. I don't have it all memorized, but, we all know it because it's in the movies. He does his own version. Pause while Oriana finds it.
While she's doing that, I will note that there is a Werrow song towards the end of the book, the end of the second book, that is all about the joys of winter or something, and has the line Kersplat in it. And just imagining Cotton seeing Kersplat makes me want to, grab him fondly by the neck and make sure that he never says another word ever again.
Yes, here it is. The road winds on before us, a path to be unwound, a surprise around at each corner, just waiting to be found. And it goes on.
Yes, no need to read anymore.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I apologize.
This is like, the whole thing is like if The Lord of the Rings was reduced to a greeting card, and it sucks.
Wow, Hallmark presents The Lord of the Rings. Okay, I'm taking this in now.
Oh, no.
Just like that the rhymes and everything that are just like the most basic rhymes, when they even happen, when the rhymes even land, it's just like...
And and I'm thinking about some of the other details we talked about how he badly is trying to, again, get the atmosphere right by just sort of porting things over. So, I mean, there's a fake Weathertop. It's called Beacon Tor.
Yep.
There's a fake Rivendell. It's called Arden Vale, even though they don't go there. There's fake Cram.
Yeah.
there's
Crew.
There's fake
Crew.
As in Motley Crue.
Oh,
right.
That's the other thing is the emissary from Not Dale is places
Lord
literally
Keon, yes.
Dael. It's Dael instead of Dale. Come on, man.
Oh, so speaking of Lord Keon or whatever.
Oh, Jesus.
That killed me. So when they he's part of the squad.
The squad goals.
Oh God. When they cross the Misty Mountains, they meet up with the Not Bjornings. And so up to this point, the book has been like calling him consistently Lord Keon. The hobbits, the Werrows, know that he's aristocracy. But then they get to the Bjornings, and the Bjornings treat him with deference. And all of a sudden the hobbits are like, oh my God, what could this mean? They're treating him with deference. And it's like, the big reveal is that he's the heir to the throne of Not Dale. But, like, why is it not registering with them that he's an aristocrat? These people would owe him allegiance anyway.
Yeah.
Why is it notable that they're being like, oh, my lord? Like,
and it leads to one of the most bizarre tonal shifts, and that's something I really want to talk about a bit more. The tonal shifts throughout is basically we mentioned about how the narrator, like Oriana was saying, they mentioned the narrator, their hobbits sort of ported over here, but even more to the point, both in narration and in dialogue, is that things just keep going back and forth in terms of what type of story you're actually trying to tell. Like one of his biggest tricks, for instance, and there was a bit of that in one of the snippets I was reading, is that he'll have a bunch of sentences in a row that begin with "and," as if there's some process being done. Like when one of the dwarves is basically given a Boromir style send off, almost literally on the river, etc., and a pyre and all that, and they bladed the things, and they prepped his things, all that, just sort of like, okay. And again, it comes out of nowhere and then goes away. Is the problem. Or it might recur later. You'll get these weird moments where all of a sudden what's meant to be just a meeting between characters all of a sudden has this thing where the ands pile on and it's meant to be significant with a capital S. But to give another idea, just to get back about Lord Kian, so when the great reveal happens, oh, don't you know, my brother here, this is the other, the brother character shows up, my brother, he's the heir to the throne, Rand, good old Rand, not Paul. And it's like, Rand says about Kian, this is my brother, he's heir to the throne of West. And all of a sudden the hobbits, weirdos are like, ugh. And then Kian says, gives this noble speech about like, don't let my position, it's this bizarre little philosophical thing, like, we have a core ethos, even though our paths are different. Don't let this remove me and my friends. And all this on Perry in response speaks this very high and mighty, think of our friends and all this. All of a sudden the tone from like this character speaking is completely different from what's been everything happening up until now. And it's like, you get this thing that every so often it's sort of like, hi, here's some ethos I want to put into the story. I will put it through the mouths of the characters. I call this Orson Scott Cardism, because that's when he really started failing as a writer. I mean, you could argue he was already there, well ahead, but by the time of Xenocide, his characters were just basically spouting philosophical points. So it's like, and it's just this weird little interruption to have in there, and then basically breaking the mood is frickin' Cotton. Hey, you need to still have some arrows around. It's like, die into the river with you. Please go into the river. Well, it's all right over there.
It's so irritating. Cotton is, he's irritating on a number of levels, but one reason this book is valuable, I think, for a given measure of value, is that the way it does so many things that Tolkien does, but badly, really makes you appreciate how good Tolkien was at stuff. Cotton, like Sam, like we were saying, is like comic relief, sort of. Sam is actually hyper competent. He's good at stuff. He's allowed moments of nobility, even that are true to himself, and not like all of a sudden switching to a different register of like these and thous. So he emerges as a real person, whereas Cotton is like, if you only read Sam as the bumbling everyman, then that's what you get when you write Cotton, is he's just like tripping over stuff or whatever, and like, what's a wagon? And it's like, ugh.
Yeah, he has these weirdly serious moments that only seem to emerge in fits and starts, and then the rest of the time he's like, and it's like,
Master Perry.
It truly is with all the characters. In fact, they don't have organic character arcs, really. Ned, I know you already said, like, the characters are just archetypes. They're not true characters at all. And that, though, like, not only that, but the way you get the characterization, it's all up front. There's no spreading out. There's no reveal, like, slowly. Like, yes, Kian is introduced as a lord and revealed as a prince. Oh, wow.
Amazing.
We should also note that when Kian is introduced, he's basically talked about how he's got his well-trimmed little, goatee around his things, and he's wearing a hat with a feather in it. So it's like frickin' like Robin Hood, Errol Flynn or something like that. I don't know.
I'm surprised it wasn't like a Robin of Locksley sort of play, but it does, like, it's that like amateurism, not knowing how to build a character over time. That's why we spend so much time in the Shire, is building Frodo and Sam.
And that's why things like the two, like splitting the party and wandering through the mines or whatever, why that doesn't feel like it matters is because nothing happens to the characters. Nothing is revealed about their relationships. They don't grow. They don't learn anything. There's a fake out where you think Ursula is dead, and it's like, yeah, he's gone. Yay, I hate him.
Right.
But then he comes back, and it doesn't matter.
For no reason.
It's just like, oh, thank God he's alive. And he's just like, yeah, I just swam really fast or something. I forget what, but it's something like that. Like, he just survived because the author couldn't bear to have him die. I don't know.
And I don't know why. It wasn't like he was some special...
He wasn't doing anything.
I have felt reluctance to kill characters off because I have grown attached to them. But like this, like, what did he do?
Let me end by talking about something that I was kind of real interested in your thoughts about this, Jared, because I remember you talking about this some time ago, just in general, and I'm like, ooh, he's really going to hate how it happens in here. And that is the two big dramatic moments, he said with implied quotes, where Perry figures things out. And everything, both cases, is done in a case where I was joking about this, calling it's Chekhov's gun scenario writ incredibly large, where a thing is introduced and has to be used. And it happens twice. in the second and final book.
And it's like in 2 paragraphs, right? I mean,
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, and the thing about it is, in one case, basically the Balrog prison, that's been the case, is stumbled upon. The what's left of the squad is chased by orcs. They're going, "Ugh," and they have to find their way out. They're like, "Hey, we're here in the lost prison where the Balrog equivalent was kept all this time. We're about to die. How do we get out of here?" When he couldn't get out of here for like thousands and thousands of years. And then basically there's stupid things and the right word being said by the right person at the right time. Perry goes, "I know, my sword. Stick the sword into this hole and that'll open a door over here." I'm like, that's really fucking convenient.
it doesn't make any sense.
And then the biggest one of all is this. Now, here again is the case where McKiernan is borrowing an element that's in Lord of the Rings and turning it into an anchor point for this entire story, which again, in the right hands, could have been really interesting.
Right.
So, what if you remember Lord of the Rings, towards the end, Merry, when he parts from Rohan and Éomer and Éowyn, Éowyn gives him a horn, and the idea is this horn of the Rohirrim, and it gives a brief bit of backstory that it was taken from a dwarf horde that was taken by a dragon, but then one of the Rohirrim ancestors came in, was able to slay the dragon, and this is a remnant of that treasure. And it's this horn, and it figures into the story. Merry blows it towards the end. Save your breath. I've got a better things there, and the whole idea inspires the hobbits and scouring the Shire. It's a really lovely element that helps wrap up the story. And so what McKiernan's done is basically said, okay, what if this thing becomes a bigger element story-wise for the entire thing? And we mentioned about how there was the final battle and all the rest of it. Without getting too much into this, because it would take far too long to explain and is pointless, the idea is that this horn turns out to be incredibly, which Cotton and brings along at Perry's suggestion, and that's the silver call referred to. That's the whole idea of the silver call. Brings in this horn. There's this whole elaborate backstory about how the dwarves have this particular history with this horn because it was taken from a dwarf horde. It refers to some sort of apocalyptic event. It becomes this big elaborate thing that is running constantly throughout. Then Perry figures it out at the last moment, is able to convey it to Durek, and the idea is that it's the worst Chekhov's gun scenario you can imagine. The idea is that if you blow the horn in the big dwarf hall that's right next to the chasm in Moria, that's right, the place where everyone's supposed to assemble where the final battle is being done. If you blow it, the idea is that if the dwarves are at their uttermost limit, here's how you will get out of it. You blow the horn, and that causes resonances in the roof of the cavern to cause the rock to cascade down and crush your enemies in a huge cascade of stone. So it's the ultimate one-off smart bomb. And Perry figures it out at just the right moment, just the last time. And it was one of those things, I remember you, Jared, saying something about how magic, when we talked in the magic episode, about things that are designed for specific purposes that are put into a story that play out exactly at the right moment. And I'm like, there you go, because that's a classic example of how terrible it is as a plot device. And it's totally antithetical to the One Ring.
Yes.
Because that's ultimately, I think, the key example between McKiernan and Tolkien here. The one big magical thing ultimately in Lord of the Rings is the One Ring, and you're meant to get rid of it. And it is ultimately as much a moral and internal things like this. There's so much going on with it. It scales itself to different things. This is just a magic horn that has to be blown in the right place at the right time
with the right volume.
Yep.
Well, so what bothered me most about that is I'm fine with the notion of like, in bare bones terms, what happens at that point is like blow the horn. The roof of the hall is a specific type that is mentioned earlier that will fall apart under certain circumstances. That's all fine. He puts it together, great. But the horn itself is, from the very beginning of the first book, established as something that the dwarves like hate and fear. So this is so stupid. So there's this whole thing where dwarves won't ride horses. They'll ride ponies, but not horses. And the Warrows are like, oh, what's up with that? I don't know. And the obvious reason to me is that dwarves are just too small to ride horses safely.
It's inconvenient.
Like, it didn't need explanation. They ride ponies in The Hobbit. That's great. I don't care. This is not something I need to know about. But the horn, it turns out, it's like got horses winding around it, which I think are described in Lord of the Rings. And there's people riding them, and in a flash of like intuition or whatever, at some point, one of the Warrows, it's probably Barry, is like, oh my god, they're dwarves, and the dwarves won't ride horses because they fear that'll bring the apocalypse or something. And it's completely stupid. It doesn't. It's like I'm broken.
We should,
I'm a broken person.
We should be putting up the video equivalent of the discussion. You should see how often we've been hanging our heads and going, good
Just
God.
like grabbing our hair. Like I get, like I think it's supposed to be like a cultural taboo against riding horses or something, but it's played as this very superstitious fear. Like if we ride a horse, the apocalypse will happen. And it's because of this horn. Like there's a stupid rhyme on it that says something like, when it's blown, everything will end, or something like that.
It's one of the worst poems. And that's saying something.
And then it turns out that this is all, like, this horn has been made specifically. It's been fashioned for this one moment.
Are you shitting me? Come on. Come on.
Like, I'm fine. So this episode is just me just gradually falling apart. There's a lot of elements to this moment that I'm fine with on their own. Like, I'm fine with an ancient prophecy, like, no man can kill me.
Love an ancient prophecy.
Yeah,
Love it.
I'm fine with this magical thing pays off here. I'm fine with that. I don't know. It could be better, whatever. But the no man thing works because it's like a surprise.
Yes.
Like, you just kind of know that no man can... But there's a lot of options when it comes to no man here. It could be anybody that's just not a man. But it's Eowyn. It's amazing. It's great. But, like, it's just this one horn for just this one moment, and it's only... Yeah. And the horn exerts, like, this weird pull on people for no reason. It's, like, very One Ring-esque.
None at all.
It just... Yeah. Again, like you were saying, with the One Ring being, like, an ethical issue, the horn doesn't have any of that meaning to it. The only meaning it has is that dwarves are afraid of it. And I do think it's actually genuinely funny when they're like, we were relieved when the dragon took it. We were happy it wasn't around anymore because we were afraid of what it meant.
And then you brought it back. Thank you. But
that's it. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't affect the characters around it until such time as it's needed, and then it's blown, and then it's like, great, you collapsed a hall.
Cool.
And now we have to deal with it for the rest of our lives.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, I enjoy is the wrong word, but I appreciated that moment. It was a tough call. It led to the deaths of many of the dwarf army as well as the enemy. It was a horrible decision, but it had to be made. I liked that in the abstract. Reading it was a nightmare, but...
I think that sort of sums it up, and I'm keeping an eye on the time. We should probably, sum it up here. This will probably be our longest episode at this rate.
Oh, really?
But, yeah. Well, we've had things to say.
Yeah.
So I'll just wrap up myself, and then if you want to just throw in last thoughts here, is that I mean I think you said it well. In the abstract, there is promise in here. It's something that if this had ever legitimately happened, and there was absolutely no way it could have happened when Christopher Tolkien was alive, and I don't see it happening now, but I could have seen something in other hands where, say, an estate had done something like that, commissioned sequel to Gone with the Wind, say, that Scarlet book that came out back in the late 80s or the 90s, whenever it was, or you have those type of things. I could see it in those cases if there were more, money grubbing interests involved or enough distance and all the rest of it. It's like, sure, we'll commission a book and do all that thing. I don't see it happening now for a variety of reasons. I think, CGRT was basically in control for so long that everyone's like, okay, no, this is the end. In another world, this is probably would have resulted, and we probably would all be talking about it the same way, precisely because it's just not that good an effort, is what it is. Your point earlier was accurate. It's valuable to read something like this once to get a sense of, okay, why does Tolkien work when so many others don't? And there are many different factors going into it, but this is a case of sort of like, there is potentially an interesting story here. It's just not well told. It just doesn't hang together, and it makes you irritated more than happy at the end of it. It's like, thanks. So, and there it is. So that's where I'll end on.
Yeah, I think what you just mentioned is the main, like, again, there was no reason this was going to completely work for me just simply because of the writing. But from a story perspective, the fundamental reason for me this doesn't work where Lord of the Rings does is it is centered around war and physical conflict, whereas the Lord of the Rings, that's just kind of the surrounding, but it is at its core an internal journey and story, and that's why it, to me, has stood the test of time and is enjoyed by so many people, whereas this is just, it is too external. It can't overcome the just abysmal writing. I'm so sorry, Mr. McKiernan. I wish you well, but yikes.
The stakes are lower, and the perspective is different. It is a story without a Dark Lord and without a sense of, what do you do when the chips are down? It just sort of, it is what it is there.
Which even that is fine, having a lower stakes story. It's just that it's treated like a high stakes one.
Yeah. Yes.
That's a good way to look at it. the announcement of next topic, it's Oriana's turn. So what are we getting next month?
Woo! Yeah, I had a really hard time coming up with anything this month, I think, because just the world ending is pretty distracting. But
Yeah. Yeah.
I would like to have what I'm sure is the first of many discussions on adaptation.
Yeah.
I think it's time
yes, definitely.
to have sort of maybe a higher level discussion of what makes Tolkien adaptable, what is not adaptable, what format is best, like strengths, weaknesses of the biggest adaptations of his work, which is just, the movies. So yeah, I think we should start there.
I think we should. Yeah, no, I like that idea. I have some ideas of like future episode topics where we focus in on one or two things in particular, but this way we can sort of get this going on a general front.
Every once in a while we go back.
Yeah, throw in. So that's great. Okay, yeah, no, that'll be good. And we'll all have many things to talk about in that regard. It's almost endless. And arguably this story we just talked about and we'll never talk about again was an adaptation, and
it was, yeah, exactly. This really had me thinking a lot of like, what could this be in different hands if you tried to make this into? Could you readapt it as a true sequel?
Yeah, it's again, fan art. I think it's just a big example of bad fan art. Is basically what it came down to. So, all right. Well, we have talked a lot. We thank you for your patience. This is almost assuredly the longest episode we've ever done, but it was so worth it because we finally got to vocalize exactly what we've been thinking about these past few things. And as I said before at the start, I first read this thing when I was in late 80s. So I've had it in my brain for a while, sensing Jared and Oriana's pure initial pain here. Well, it reminds me of just how bad it is. So, anyway, we thank you all for listening. We hope you stay well. And again, that'll be something I'm sure we'll be wishing people for quite a while to come as we work through all this. Best to everybody, especially if your world leaders are of not the best quality. So good luck to you, depending where you are and depending where you're at and how you're listening in. But we will all see you next month. Here's to a hopefully brighter spring as we go. So until next time, thanks, and we'll talk to you then. Bye. Thanks again for listening to this episode of By-The-Bywater. Please subscribe and rate us via your favorite podcast listening options.
Episodes and show notes are at megaphonic.fm/bythebywater, all one word. You can also message us through here. Email us at bythebywater@megaphonic.fm or follow us on Twitter at By-The-Bywater.
You can also follow us individually on Twitter and ask questions there. I'm at Vandroid Helsing.
I'm at Schwinter, SCHWINDTER.
And I'm Ned Raggett, 2 G's, 2 T's. By-The-Bywater is a proud member of Megaphonic Podcast Network. Find all our fancy little shows at megaphonic.fm. We hope you join us again next time. Until then, Namarie.